This is Medical Device Legal News. Today is January 5th, 2024. I'm Sam Bernstein. Joining me today is my colleague, Sophie Moros. Sophie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Happy to be here.
December 27th, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General posted favorable advisory opinion 23-11, which involved a medical device manufacturer subsidizing certain Medicare cost-sharing obligations in connection with a clinical trial that it was sponsoring. Sophie, can you tell us a little bit about this request and opinion?
So here, the requester is a manufacturer of a device designed to modulate the strength of cardiac muscle contraction in patients experiencing heart failure and is approved by the FDA for use in patients with heart failure with a left ventricular ejection function ranging from 25 to 45%. The device is an implantable device requiring a single surgical treatment, but patients may receive follow-up services as well. The requester is sponsoring an IDE clinical trial to determine the safety and efficacy of the product in patients with a higher ejection fraction from 40 to 60%, which will include a control group. Medicare approved the study as a Category B IDE study for which Medicare pays for the device and routine care items and services furnished in the study. Under the proposal, the manufacturer would pay the cost-sharing obligations of Medicare beneficiaries participating in the study that they would otherwise owe for study-related Medicare reimbursable items and services, up to a maximum of $2,000 per study participant. The requester indicated that the proposal was necessary to reduce financial barriers to enrollment, facilitate socioeconomic diversity in study participants, and preserve the blinding of participants. Participants would incur cost-sharing amounts for appointments required by the study, including the initial screening, surgical implantation, and follow-up appointments. The requester also indicated that it did not want providers to collect cost-sharing amounts from control group participants because they did not have the potential to receive any therapeutic benefit during the study, and that collecting such amounts from the treatment group could result in unblinding of the study. The availability of the cost-sharing subsidies would not be advertised, but would only be included in the informed consent documents. The OIG determined that the arrangement would potentially implicate both the federal anti-kickback statute and the beneficiary inducement civil monetary penalty law, as it would pay cost-sharing amounts of participants, which would potentially induce them to participate in the study and receive Medicare reimbursable services, and it would guarantee that participating sites and investigators would receive cost-sharing amounts. The OIG determined that although no potential safe harbor to the AKS or exception to the beneficiary inducement CMP law would apply, the risk of fraud and abuse presented by the proposed arrangement was sufficiently low to issue a favorable advisory opinion. Specifically, the OIG determined that the subsidy was a reasonable means of promoting enrollment in light of the cost sharing being cost prohibitive and the need to enroll socioeconomically diverse participants. The OIG also determined that it would pose a low risk of inappropriate overutilization, as the induced services would be governed by the protocol, subject to enrollment criteria with an enrollment cap, and be overseen by the Institutional Review Board. The OIG also gave significant weight to the fact that CMS had approved the study as a Category B IDE, meaning that CMS had determined that the study design was appropriate to answer questions of importance to CMS. And in addition, the OIG differentiated the arrangement from potentially problematic seating arrangements where manufacturers initially offer subsidies to lock in future utilization.
Thank you, Sophie. I think this is an important OIG advisory opinion that's helpful to sponsors conducting studies where Medicare may cover certain costs associated with the study and there are significant cost-sharing amounts. Although advisory opinions cannot be used as a defense or relied upon by anyone except the requester, this opinion is helpful to understanding the government's views of clinical studies with cost-sharing amounts that may disincentivize enrollment. Over the past few years, we've seen a number of examples of clinical trials that raise fraud and abuse issues, and accordingly, the requester's decision to request an advisory opinion was important and I think the correct one. The types of issues that we've seen have been trials where the government views the trial as a sham, trials that overcompensate sites and investigators to induce future utilization, trials that involve providing excess products for free, as well as trials that involve participant incentives. Sponsors should carefully consider compliance concerns when designing protocols and related budgets to ensure compliance with applicable fraud and abuse laws, including federal anti-kickback statute issues, as well as issues under the beneficiary inducement civil monetary penalty laws. On December 22nd, the FDA released final guidance regarding the use of digital health technologies for remote data acquisition in clinical trials. The guidance provides recommendations to ensure that digital health technologies used in an investigation are fit for their intended purpose, taking into account the design and functions of the digital health technology. As you're likely aware, the FDA's guidance documents do not generally establish legally enforceable responsibilities unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited, but rather, when finalized, instead describe the agency's current thinking on a topic and should primarily be reviewed and addressed as recommendations. Sophie, can you talk a little bit about the different types of digital health technologies addressed by the guidance and how the FDA recommends that sponsors select DHTs?
Sure, Sam. So, in selecting DHTs for use in a trial, the guidance recommends that sponsors consider the suitability of the DHT for the clinical trial population, taking into account the age, health, education, and other attributes of the trial participants to ensure that they will be able to appropriately use the DHT. The guidance also suggests that sponsors adopt minimum technical and performance specifications for the DHT and consider the design and operation of the DHT to ensure that it is fit for its intended purpose. The FDA also recommends that sponsors evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of allowing participants to use their own DHTs or devices. Examples of DHTs in the guidance include FDA-authorized continuous glucose monitors and spirometers, general-purpose computing platforms such as smartphones or tablets, tracker bracelets with sensors, and clinical assessment mobile applications.
Thank you, Sophie. The guidance also addresses the need for DHTs as well as general-purpose computing platforms on which they operate to be appropriately validated to ensure that they're adequate to support their intended use in the study. The topics covered by the guidance to address this issue include the selection of DHTs suitable for clinical investigations, how to describe DHTs in regulatory submissions, methods for verifying and validating DHTs, using DHTs to collect data for trial endpoints, how to address risks associated with using DHTs in clinical investigations, safeguards that sponsors and investigators should adopt for retaining and protecting data that is collected by DHTs, particularly if it's a personal mobile device or the participant's computer, as well as the responsibilities of sponsors and investigators in using DHTs in connection with clinical investigations. The guidance also addresses the use of DHTs in clinical investigations that constitute medical devices and the need to adopt design controls to ensure that DHTs that are medical devices are performing as intended. The guidance also addresses how DHTs that are medical devices will be treated differently depending on whether the DHT is a significant risk device and may therefore potentially require the submission of its own IDE. If a sponsor conducts the verification and validation activities recommended by the guidance to ensure that a DHT used in investigation for remote data collection is fit for its intended purpose, the FDA does not intend to review the sponsor's compliance with design control requirements for that particular DHT. On December 21st, the FDA also released updated draft guidance regarding the 510K third-party review program, as well as the third-party emergency use authorization review program. Comments to this guidance document are due on February 20th, 2024. Under the 510K program, the FDA will recognize certain third parties to review 510K submissions and recommend initial classification of certain low to moderate risk devices. The FDA may also contract with third-party review organizations to review EUA requests during an emergency declaration. The guidance addresses the FDA's expectations for these programs, including expectations regarding addressing conflicts of interest, the factors that the FDA will use in determining device eligibility for the 510K program, the process for the recognition, re-recognition, suspension, or withdrawal of recognition of participants and reviewers under the 510K review program, and expectations regarding third-party review or compensation. Earlier on December 19th, the FDA issued draft guidance regarding the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. Comments to this guidance document are due February 20th as well. The guidance clarifies how the FDA intends to evaluate real-world data to determine whether it is of sufficient quality to generate real-world evidence that can be used by the FDA in its regulatory decision-making for medical devices. It also contains recommendations for sponsors to consider in using real-world evidence to support regulatory submissions, such as in 510Ks, IDEs, PMAs, HDEs, de novo submissions, and CLIA waiver applications, among others. Under the guidance, the FDA will consider the use of real-world data to be fit for the purpose of supporting clinical evidence for regulatory decision-making when it is relevant to and reliable for informing or supporting the regulatory decision. In fraud and abuse news, on December 19th, Aaron Foley and Ted Albin were arrested on charges of healthcare fraud and conspiracy to violate the federal anti-kickback statute. Foley and Albin ran a Medicare billing company, Grapevine Professional Services, that allegedly billed Medicare for more than $25 million in fraudulent claims for durable medical equipment. Foley and Albin allegedly illegally purchased durable medical equipment orders for use by their DME supplier companies to submit allegedly fraudulent claims to Medicare. Foley and Albin also allegedly acted as brokers for DME orders and received kickbacks for introducing buyers and sellers of DME orders. Foley and Albin each face up to 55 years in prison. This case reflects the DOJ's continued enforcement efforts in the DME POS space, and we've seen quite a few DME POS enforcement cases over the past year. Sophie, can you talk about a few of the other recent DME POS cases prosecuted by the DOJ?
On December 21st, Elizabeth Hernandez, a nurse practitioner, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in a scheme to defraud Medicare for over $192 million in claims for genetic tests and DME that patients did not need, as well as telemedicine visits that never occurred. As you may recall from our prior reporting, Hernandez allegedly signed thousands of orders for medically unnecessary orthotic braces and genetic tests for Medicare beneficiaries she never spoke to, examined, or treated. She also allegedly billed Medicare for thousands of telemedicine visits she never performed, billing over 24 hours of telemedicine encounters in a single day. Hernandez received approximately $1.6 million in connection with the scheme. And then on December 19th, Nico Romanowski pled guilty to conspiracy to violate the anti-kickback statute and commit healthcare fraud. Romanowski conspired with DME companies, telemedicine companies, and doctors to submit false claims to Medicare and TRICARE. Romanowski operated a marketing company that would call Medicare and TRICARE beneficiaries and pressure them to agree to accept DME, often including braces. The callers would earn commissions, bonuses, and incentives to convince the beneficiaries to accept the DME, regardless of medical necessity. Romanowski then paid kickbacks to telemedicine companies that then paid kickbacks to doctors to obtain orders for the DME, regardless of medical necessity, often without speaking with the patient. The orders were then provided to various DME suppliers in exchange for kickbacks. And Romanowski is now facing up to 15 years in prison and significant fines. On December 13th, Robert Leon Smith III was indicted for his role in a $60 million healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and kickback scheme involving the submission of false claims to Medicare for medically unnecessary DME, genetic tests, and foot bath medications. Similar to the other cases, Smith owned a number of DME companies in Florida, Texas, and Maryland, through which he allegedly billed Medicare for medically unnecessary orthotic braces and allegedly referred orders for medically unnecessary braces, genetic tests, and medications to other DME suppliers, pharmacies, and labs. Smith allegedly paid offshore call centers to obtain Medicare beneficiary information and then pressure Medicare beneficiaries to accept medically unnecessary products. He also allegedly paid telemedicine companies for fraudulent doctor's orders.
On December 11th, Delora Technologies LLC entered into a settlement agreement with the DOJ to resolve False Claims Act allegations that it caused medical providers to submit false claims to Medicare for the use of the sphenocath device to treat migraine headaches by administering nerve blocks to the sphenopalatine ganglion. As we previously reported, the sphenocath was not approved by the FDA for this use, and the FDA had previously recommended that Delore conduct investigational studies to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the sphenocath. This case is a good reminder that, subject to certain exceptions, Medicare and other payers generally do not pay for the use of products that have not been cleared or approved by the FDA or that are not otherwise exempt from pre-market submission requirements. Accordingly, the marketing of such devices not only raises concerns under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but may also create False Claims Act liability and overpayment liability as a result of encouraging customers to submit claims for non-covered products.
In another recent False Claims Act case on December 18th, the manufacturer of a remote cardiac monitoring device agreed to pay $14.7 million to resolve allegations that they submitted false claims to federal healthcare programs for a higher level of remote cardiac monitoring service than physicians had intended to order, and that was medically unnecessary. The device is capable of 3 different levels of cardiac monitoring, including Holter, event monitoring, and telemetry, with telemetry providing the highest rate of reimbursement. The company was alleged to have designed the enrollment portal to cause clinical staff to unwittingly select telemetry and, through its sales representatives, allegedly instructed clinical staff to select telemetry despite clinical notes and instructions to the contrary.
Thank you, Sophie. This case echoes the government's historical concerns regarding upcoding, but also addresses an important design issue. For devices with different modes of operation that may result in different services being rendered and different levels of codes being billed, it's important to ensure that the process for selecting the mode or service to be rendered is clear and straightforward, and does not encourage or cause the accidental selection of a higher complexity service. Liability under the False Claims Act may attach for causing someone to submit a false claim. So that means that design features or enrollment procedures or even sales processes that may cause providers to order or use a higher complexity modality than otherwise is medically necessary, or bill a higher complexity code than is medically necessary or even ordered, may expose manufacturers as well as DME POS suppliers to potential False Claims Act liability, as well as exposing their customers to potential overpayment liability. Thank you for joining us this week for Medical Device Legal News. I'm Sam Bernstein, a partner in McGuireWoods Healthcare Group.
And I'm Sophie Moros. We're looking forward to seeing you next time.